The early morning sun cast long shadows across the private aviation terminal as Sarah Thompson pulled up to the entrance in her Tesla Model 3. The car wasn't flashy like the other vehicles in the parking lot. No Bentleys or Rolls-Royces here. But Sarah had always believed in being smart with her money, even after becoming a successful tech CEO. She checked her watch, 7:15 a.m., perfect timing for her 8 a.m. flight to Seattle. The morning air was crisp, and few people were around at this hour, just how she liked it. Sarah adjusted her simple black hoodie and pulled her small carry-on bag from the trunk. Unlike many executives who traveled with designer luggage, she carried a practical wheeled suitcase that had served her well for the past 5 years. At 42 years old, Sarah had built her cybersecurity company from nothing into a billion-dollar enterprise. Today's meeting with potential investors could take her company to even greater heights. But looking at her, no one would guess she was worth millions. Her curly hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore minimal makeup. Her outfit, a hoodie, comfortable jeans, and white sneakers, was chosen for the 6-hour flight ahead. As she walked toward the terminal entrance, Sarah noticed the usual morning crew beginning their shifts. The coffee shop inside was just opening, filling the air with the scent of fresh brew. A young man mopped the floor, offering her a friendly good morning smile. Sarah always made it a point to learn the names of the regular staff, believing that success shouldn't change how you treat people. She pulled out her phone to check her emails one last time before boarding. Her company, Secure Flow Solutions, had grown from a small startup in her garage to employing over 3,000 people worldwide. The upcoming meeting in Seattle could help them expand into Asia, potentially doubling their size. Sarah smiled, remembering how many people had doubted a black woman could succeed in the tech security field. The terminal was quiet, with only the soft hum of air conditioning and distant radio chatter from the runway. Through the large windows, Sarah could see her company's jet, a modest Cessna Citation, being prepared for takeoff. The pilot, Captain Rodriguez, was already doing his pre-flight checks. She had hired him 3 years ago, and he had proven to be one of the best decisions she'd made for her executive team. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out her terminal access card, something she'd done hundreds of times before. Her phone buzzed with a message from her assistant confirming that everything was ready for the Seattle presentation. The proposals were loaded on her tablet, the meeting room was booked, and her schedule was perfectly planned. As she approached the security checkpoint, Sarah noticed a new guard she hadn't seen before. He was older, probably in his 50s, with graying hair and a stern expression that seemed permanently etched on his face. His name tag read Richard Wells. Something about his posture made Sarah pause for a brief moment. She had seen that look before, that immediate judgment in someone's eyes when they saw her. She took a deep breath, reminding herself of what her mother always said: "Hold your head high and let your success speak for itself." Over the years, Sarah had developed a thick skin and a strategic mind for handling prejudice. Sometimes, the best response was to stay calm and let people's assumptions collapse under the weight of their own ignorance. The morning sun continued to rise, painting the sky in beautiful shades of orange and pink. A few more employees had arrived at the terminal, going about their morning routines. Sarah could hear the distant roar of a commercial airliner taking off from the main airport runway. Everything seemed normal, routine, peaceful. Little did Sarah know that in the next few minutes, this ordinary morning would turn into something entirely different. As she walked towards the tarmac entrance, pulling out her credentials, she couldn't have predicted how this day would not only test her patience but also create an opportunity for real change in an unexpected way. She stepped forward, credentials in hand, ready to begin what she thought would be just another business trip. The events that would unfold in the next few moments would spark a chain reaction that would affect not just her day, but the lives of everyone involved in ways they couldn't imagine. Richard Wells stood at his post, watching Sarah approach with narrowed eyes. In his 15 years as a security guard at this private terminal, he had developed what he called a sixth sense about people who didn't belong. Today, that sense was telling him something was off about the woman in the hoodie and jeans walking towards the private jet area. "Stop right there," Richard called out, his voice sharp and commanding. He stepped forward, placing himself directly in Sarah's path. His hand instinctively moved to rest on his security belt, a gesture he often used to show authority. "This is a restricted area, private jets only." Sarah remained calm, reaching into her pocket for her credentials. "Good morning, sir. I understand. I have my—" "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step back," Richard interrupted, raising his hand. "This area is for authorized personnel and jet owners only." His tone carried a hint of satisfaction, the kind that came from feeling certain about putting someone in their place. The morning sun now fully illuminated the terminal, and a few other staff members had started to notice the interaction. Sarah could feel their eyes on her, but this wasn't the first time she had faced such a situation. She took a deep breath and tried again. "Sir, if you'll just let me show you my credentials," Sarah began, her voice steady and professional. "Listen," Richard cut her off again, this time taking a step closer. "I don't know how you got past the front entrance, but this isn't the regular airport. These are private jets." He spoke slowly, as if explaining something to a child. "Perhaps you're lost and looking for the main terminal." Sarah pulled out her phone and started recording, keeping it subtle at her side. Years of experience had taught her to document these encounters. "Mr. Wells," she said, reading his name tag, "I'm trying to show you my identification and—" "No, you're trying to argue with me," Richard said, his voice getting louder. He reached for his radio. "Security backup to tarmac entry point A. We have an uncooperative individual attempting to access restricted areas." By now, several ground crew members had stopped their work to watch. A young fuel technician who recognized Sarah started walking toward them, but Richard waved him away. "Stay back. I'm handling this situation." Sarah remained remarkably composed, though her heart was beating faster. She thought about all the young black women and men in her company who looked up to her, who needed to see that maintaining dignity in the face of prejudice was possible. "Mr. Wells, I'm Sarah Thompson, and that's my jet you're preventing me from boarding," she said clearly, holding up her credentials. "I have a meeting in Seattle that I need to get to." Richard let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Right. And I'm Jeff Bezos." He crossed his arms, planting his feet firmly. "Ma'am, I'm going to give you one last chance to leave voluntarily before I have to escort you out." The situation was quickly drawing more attention. Two other security guards approached from behind Richard, responding to his call. Sarah could see her pilot, Captain Rodriguez, starting to descend the plane's stairs, concern evident on his face. "I've had enough of this," Sarah said quietly, pulling out her phone to make a call. She pressed a number on speed dial, maintaining eye contact with Richard. "Yes, this is Sarah Thompson. Could you please send Marcus down to the tarmac entrance? We seem to have a situation." Richard's face reddened with anger. "Put the phone away. You're not authorized to make calls in this area." He turned to his approaching colleagues. "We need to remove her from the premises." Just then, the terminal door burst open. Marcus Chen, the terminal manager, came rushing out, his face a mix of concern and recognition. He had received Sarah's call and immediately knew something was very wrong. The look on Richard's face began to change as he watched his boss hurrying toward them. The morning that had started with Richard Wells feeling so sure about himself was about to take an unexpected turn. In just a few moments, his world, and his understanding of it, would be completely shaken. The consequences of his actions were about to unfold in ways he never could have anticipated. Marcus Chen, the terminal manager, rushed toward the growing scene with quick steps. His normally neat tie was slightly crooked from his hurried movement. Behind him, several other staff members followed, curiosity and concern clear on their faces. "Miss Thompson," Marcus called out, slightly out of breath. "I'm so sorry about this misunderstanding." He reached the group and positioned himself between Sarah and Richard. The security guard's face had turned from red to pale in a matter of seconds. Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. You know her?" He stammered, his earlier confidence completely gone. His hands, which had been so firmly placed on his security belt, now hung limply at his sides. "Know her?" Marcus turned to face Richard, his voice sharp with disbelief. "Mr. Wells, this is Sarah Thompson. She's one of our most valued clients. She's been using our terminal for the past 5 years." The manager's normally calm demeanor was cracking under the strain of the situation. Sarah held up her hand gently. "Marcus, please. Let's handle this professionally." She stopped her phone's recording and slipped it into her pocket. The small crowd that had gathered watched in tense silence as Sarah finally pulled out her identification card and various credentials. "Here are my papers, Mr. Wells," she said calmly, holding them out. "My pilot's flight plan, my jet's registration, my terminal access card, and my company ID as CEO of SecureFlow Solutions." Each document she presented made Richard shrink a little more. Captain Rodriguez had now joined the group, standing protectively near Sarah. "Miss Thompson, we're running behind schedule for our takeoff slot," he said, shooting an angry look at Richard. "Should I radio the tower for a new time?" The young fuel technician who had tried to intervene earlier stepped forward. "Miss Thompson, I'm so sorry. I should have spoken up sooner. I fuel your jet every week, and I knew who you were, but Mr. Wells wouldn't let me explain." Richard's face had gone from pale to almost gray. His hands were shaking slightly as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. The two security guards who had come as backup were now slowly backing away, trying to distance themselves from the situation. Sarah looked around at all the faces watching them. Some showed anger, others showed shame, and a few showed genuine concern. She thought about how this moment could either destroy someone's career or create an opportunity for real change. "Marcus," Sarah said, her voice clear and controlled, "I'd like to have a meeting. Not to file a complaint, but to discuss something more important." She turned to look directly at Richard, who couldn't meet her eyes. "Mr. Wells, I'd like you to join us, along with any other security staff who are available." Richard's head snapped up in surprise. This wasn't the reaction he had expected. Where was the shouting? Where were the demands for his immediate firing? The threats of lawsuits that usually came in situations like this? Marcus looked uncertain. "Miss Thompson, your flight to Seattle. The investors are expecting you." "Call my office," Sarah replied. "Tell them I'll be slightly delayed due to an important opportunity that's come up." She smiled slightly. "Sometimes the most important meetings are the ones we don't plan for." The crowd began to disperse as Marcus led Sarah and a very shaken Richard toward the terminal building. The morning sun now fully lit up the tarmac, making the private jets gleam like silver birds waiting to take flight. But for now, Sarah's jet would wait. Captain Rodriguez returned to the plane to make the necessary schedule adjustments. The young fuel technician went back to his work, but not before giving Richard one last disappointed look. The other security guards returned to their posts, already whispering about what had just happened. As they walked toward the terminal's conference room, Sarah pulled out her phone again. She quickly typed out a message to her Seattle investors. Slight delay. Something more important came up. An opportunity to make real change. She pressed send and put her phone away, ready to turn this difficult morning into something meaningful. Behind them, Richard Wells followed silently, his mind racing with thoughts about how differently he could have handled the situation and wondering what would happen next in that conference room. The conference room was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Richard Wells sat stiffly in his chair, his security uniform feeling suddenly too tight around his neck. Across the table, Sarah Thompson sat calmly, her hands folded in front of her. Marcus Chen, the terminal manager, had taken a seat between them, nervously adjusting his tie for the 10th time. "Before we begin," Sarah said, breaking the tense silence, "would anyone like some coffee?" She gestured to the young assistant who had brought in a fresh pot. The simple offer of coffee seemed to catch Richard off guard. It wasn't what he expected from someone he had just tried to block from their own jet. "Yes, please," Richard mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. His hands were shaking slightly as he accepted the cup. 15 years of working security, and he had never been in a situation quite like this. Sarah took a sip from her own cup and began speaking. "Mr. Wells, do you know what my company does?" When Richard shook his head, she continued. "SecureFlow Solutions provide cybersecurity for some of the biggest companies in the world. We protect them from threats that could destroy their business." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But do you know how I started? In my garage, with just a laptop and a dream. And do you know what my biggest challenge was?" She leaned forward slightly. "It wasn't the technology. It was people who looked at me and decided, without knowing anything about me, that I didn't belong." Richard's face flushed red with shame. He stared down at his coffee cup, unable to meet Sarah's eyes. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but Sarah held up her hand to stop him from speaking. I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad, Mr. Wells, Sarah continued. I'm telling you this because I see an opportunity here. You see, what happened out there on the tarmac, that wasn't just about you and me. It's about a bigger problem that exists everywhere. She pulled out her tablet and opened a few files. Did you know that in private aviation, less than 1% of jet owners are black, and even fewer are women? She showed them some statistics, but that number is growing. Change is coming, Mr. Wells, whether people are ready or not. Richard finally found his voice. Miss Thompson, I don't know what to say. I made a terrible mistake. I understand if you want me fired. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Sarah surprised him again by shaking her head. Firing you won't solve anything. It won't fix the bigger problem. Instead, I have a different proposal. She turned to Marcus. I want to fund a new training program for all terminal staff. Not just basic security training, but real education about diversity and inclusion. Marcus's eyes widened. You want to help us? After what happened? Yes, Sarah said firmly. And I want Mr. Wells to be part of developing this program. Both Richard and Marcus looked at her in shock. Sometimes, the people who learn the hardest lessons become the best teachers. Richard's hands had stopped shaking. He looked at Sarah with a mix of confusion and gratitude. Why would you give me this chance? I treated you terribly out there. Sarah smiled slightly. Because 15 years ago, someone gave me a chance when they could have just shown me the door. Sometimes, people just need an opportunity to learn and grow. She pulled out more documents from her briefcase. These are some initial ideas for the training program. I'd like both of you to look them over. My HR team will help develop the materials, and we'll make this terminal a model for others to follow. The morning sun now streamed through the conference room windows, casting a warm glow over the three people seated at the table. Outside, they could hear the normal sounds of the terminal, jets taking off, crews working, life going on. But inside this room, something important was changing. Richard Wells looked down at the documents in front of him, then back at Sarah Thompson. The woman he had tried to stop from boarding her own jet was now offering him a chance to be part of something bigger than himself. In that moment, he realized that this morning's mistake might actually become the most important moment of his career. 2 weeks had passed since the incident at the terminal. The large training room was filled with 20 security staff members, all sitting in neat rows. At the front of the room stood Richard Wells, wearing a new navy blue polo shirt with training coordinator embroidered on it. His hands were slightly sweaty as he arranged his presentation materials. Sarah Thompson sat quietly in the back of the room, dressed in her usual simple style. She had flown in specifically for this first training session, wanting to see how her investment in change would begin. Next to her sat Jessica Martinez, SecureFlow's head of HR, who had spent the past 2 weeks helping develop the training program. Good morning, everyone, Richard began, his voice shakier than he would have liked. I'm sure you all know why we're here today. 2 weeks ago, I made a serious mistake, a mistake that could have cost me my job, but instead, he paused, looking at Sarah in the back of the room. Instead, it taught me one of the most important lessons of my life. The room was silent. Many of the security staff had been present during the incident, and they watched with curiosity as their former colleague stood before them as their trainer. Richard clicked to the first slide of his presentation, showing a photo of the terminal entrance. For 15 years, I stood at that entrance, he continued, his voice growing stronger. I thought I knew exactly who belonged and who didn't. I had created a picture in my mind of what a private jet owner looked like. And that picture, he shook his head. That picture was wrong in so many ways. Jessica nodded encouragingly from the back as Richard shared detailed statistics about diversity in aviation, business ownership, and corporate leadership. The security staff leaned forward in their seats, many taking notes, as Richard explained how unconscious bias could affect their work. Miss Thompson could have demanded my firing, Richard said, his voice now clear and confident. Instead, she showed me something I hadn't seen before, the power of turning a mistake into an opportunity for growth. Sarah watched as Richard played video clips showing various scenarios of bias in action. The staff participated in role-playing exercises, discussing how they would handle different situations. What impressed her most was Richard's honesty about his own mistakes. During a short break, a young security guard approached Sarah. Miss Thompson, she said quietly, I was too afraid to speak up that day. I saw what was happening but didn't know what to do. Thank you for showing us a better way. As the training resumed, Richard introduced a new section about communication skills. It's not just about avoiding bias, he explained. It's about learning to treat everyone with respect and dignity. It's about asking the right questions in the right way. Marcus Chen, who had been watching from the doorway, smiled as he saw his security team engaged in passionate discussions about proper procedures and respectful interactions. The training was already showing positive results. After the session, Richard approached Sarah, standing straighter than he had 2 weeks ago. Miss Thompson, I hope this first session met your expectations. His face showed genuine concern for her approval. Sarah stood up, smoothing her jeans. Mr. Wells, do you know what impressed me most? She gestured toward the room where staff members were still discussing the training materials. You didn't just read from a script. You shared your own story, your own learning process. That's what will make this program work. Jessica stepped forward with a folder. The feedback forms are already showing positive responses. They'd appreciate learning from someone who understands their perspective and has gone through his own transformation. Richard looked at the security staff, his colleagues, with new eyes. You know, Miss Thompson, when you first suggested this program, I thought it was just a nice way of not firing me. But now, he smiled for the first time that day. Now I understand that this is about something much bigger than just me. Sarah checked her watch. She had another flight to catch soon, but before leaving, she turned to Richard one last time. Remember, Mr. Wells, true change doesn't happen overnight. It happens one person at a time, one conversation at a time. As Sarah walked out of the training room, she could hear Richard already planning with Jessica for the next session. Behind her, the sounds of engaged discussion and learning filled the air, proving that sometimes the best response to prejudice isn't punishment, it's education and opportunity for change. 3 months had passed since the first training session. The private terminal looked different now, not in its physical appearance, but in the way people worked there. Richard Wells stood at his old security post, but today he wasn't checking IDs. He was teaching a new guard named Michael how to properly greet and verify visitors. Remember, Richard explained, adjusting Michael's name tag, every person who walks through that door deserves respect, regardless of how they look or what they're wearing. The young guard nodded, taking notes in a small notebook that had become standard equipment for all security staff. The morning sun was bright, and the terminal was busy with its usual traffic. A woman in workout clothes approached the entrance, pulling a simple carry-on bag. Michael stepped forward, following the new protocols Richard had helped develop. Good morning, ma'am, Michael said with a warm smile. May I see your credentials, please? His tone was professional but friendly, exactly as Richard had taught him. The woman turned out to be a successful tech entrepreneur, and Michael handled the verification process perfectly. Richard beamed with pride. Just a few months ago, he might have made the same mistake with this visitor that he had made with Sarah Thompson, but things were different now. The terminal had become a model for other private aviation facilities, with people coming from other airports to learn about their training program. Later that morning, Richard sat in his small office, reviewing feedback forms from the latest training session. The walls were covered with charts showing diversity statistics and thank you notes from visitors who had noticed the positive changes. His phone buzzed with a message from Marcus Chen, Sarah Thompson arriving in 30 minutes for program review. Richard straightened his collar and gathered his reports. The past 3 months had been the most challenging and rewarding of his career. He had trained over 100 staff members, not just from their terminal but from other airports too. Each session began with him sharing his own story of prejudice and transformation. When Sarah's car pulled up to the terminal, Richard watched through the window as 3 different staff members properly greeted her. There was no hesitation, no suspicion, just professional courtesy and respect. She noticed him watching and gave a small wave as she walked inside. Mr. Wells, Sarah said, entering his office. I hear you've been busy. She looked around at the walls, noting the positive feedback posted there. Very busy, it seems. Richard pulled out a thick folder. Miss Thompson, let me show you what we've accomplished. His voice was confident now, nothing like the shaky whisper from 3 months ago. We trained all existing staff and implemented new hiring procedures. Complaints about discriminatory treatment have dropped to 0. Sarah sat down. genuinely interested. Richard showed her statistics, training materials, and most importantly, stories of change. He told her about James, a senior guard who had admitted his own biases and was now one of their best trainers. About Maria, who had created a new welcome guide for staff that was being adopted by other terminals. But the most important change, Richard said, pulling out one last document, is this. It was a letter from a young black woman who had recently bought her first private jet. She wrote about how welcome she felt at the terminal, how the staff had treated her with dignity and respect from day one. Sarah read the letter carefully, a small smile playing on her lips. You know, Mr. Wells, when I proposed this training program, I hoped it would make a difference. But I never expected this level of transformation. Richard stood up straighter. Miss Thompson, that day when I tried to stop you from boarding your jet, I was living in a small world of my own prejudices. You could have ended my career. Instead, you helped me find my true calling. A group of trainees walked past the office window, each wearing the new terminal uniform with its Respect First badge. Sarah watched them, remembering her own experiences of being judged and dismissed. The real test of change, Sarah said, standing up to leave, is not just in how we treat people when we know they're important. It's in how we treat everyone, every day, regardless of who we think they might be. Richard nodded, understanding the deeper meaning of her words. As he watched Sarah walk toward her jet, he saw Michael greet her perfectly, following all the protocols. The morning sun caught the training coordinator badge on Richard's chest, reminding him that sometimes life's biggest mistakes can lead to its most important missions. 6 months had passed since the training program began. On this bright morning, the private terminal was unusually busy. News cameras were set up outside, and a small stage had been built in the main lobby. Banners hung from the ceiling announcing Excellence in Aviation Security and Diversity Training Awards. Richard Wells stood in front of the mirror in his office, adjusting his new suit. It was the first suit he had bought in 10 years, chosen specially for today's ceremony. On his desk sat a speech he had rehearsed 100 times, the paper now wrinkled from constant handling. Nervous? Marcus Chen asked, poking his head through the door. The terminal manager had become one of Richard's closest supporters over the past months. The TV crews are all set up, and the aviation board members are starting to arrive. Richard nodded, picking up his speech again. Their terminal's training program had caught the attention of the National Aviation Security Board. Today, they would receive an award for creating the best diversity and security training program in the country. Outside, Sarah Thompson's familiar Tesla pulled into the parking lot. She stepped out wearing a simple but elegant business suit, followed by a group of executives from various airlines and private aviation companies. They had all come to learn about the program that was changing the face of aviation security. The lobby filled quickly with people. Richard saw his trainees working professionally, checking credentials and greeting guests with respect. Michael, the young guard he had trained, was now handling VIP protocols like a seasoned professional. Ladies and gentlemen, Marcus began at the podium. 6 months ago, our terminal experienced an incident that could have ended very differently. Instead, thanks to the wisdom of one person and the willingness of another to learn and change, we created something extraordinary. The crowd listened as Marcus explained how their training program had spread to 15 other terminals across the country, how complaint rates had dropped to zero, and how customer satisfaction had reached all-time highs. Sarah sat in the front row, remembering that tense morning that had started it all. She watched as Richard walked to the podium, no longer the prejudiced guard who had tried to block her path, but a man transformed by his experience. "Good morning," Richard began, his voice clear and confident. 6 months ago, I was a security guard who thought I knew exactly what a private jet owner looked like. I was wrong, and that mistake taught me the most valuable lesson of my life. He looked at Sarah as he continued. Sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest opportunities for growth. Miss Thompson could have demanded my firing. Instead, she saw an opportunity to create real change. Richard shared stories from their training sessions. He told them about James, who now ran the program at another terminal, about Maria, whose welcome guide had become standard across the industry, about Michael, who had just been promoted to lead trainer for new staff. Our program doesn't just teach people what not to do, Richard explained. It shows them how to be better, how to see beyond their biases, and how to treat everyone with dignity and respect. The aviation board chairman stepped forward with a large plaque. For outstanding achievement in transforming aviation security training, he read, and for creating a model program that sets new standards for our industry. As Richard accepted the award, he saw tears in some of his trainees' eyes. They had all been part of this journey, all learned and grown together. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment for the evening news. After the ceremony, Sarah approached Richard. "You've come a long way from that morning at the security checkpoint," she said with a smile. "How does it feel?" Richard looked at the award in his hands, then at the busy terminal around him. "It feels like I finally found my true purpose," he replied. "You didn't just save my job that day, Ms. Thompson. You helped me find my calling." As the crowds began to disperse, a young black woman approached the security checkpoint with a carry-on bag. Michael greeted her warmly, followed all protocols perfectly, and discovered she was a new jet owner making her first flight. Richard watched with pride as his staff handled everything professionally. The morning sun streamed through the terminal windows, catching the award plaque and making it shine. Sometimes, he thought, the best changes start with admitting our mistakes and being willing to learn from them. 1 year had passed since that fateful morning at the terminal. The season had come full circle, and once again, the early morning sun cast long shadows across the private aviation terminal. But everything else had changed. Richard Wells stood in the terminal's new training center, a state-of-the-art facility that had been built specifically for their expanding program. The walls were lined with photos showing diverse groups of aviation professionals, and a large screen displayed their motto: "Respect first, questions later." Today was special. It marked the first nationwide conference for aviation security diversity training. Representatives from over 50 airports across the country had come to learn from their success story. The terminal buzzed with excitement as security personnel, airport managers, and aviation executives filled the conference room. "Can you believe it's been a year?" Marcus Chen asked, helping Richard arrange the welcome packets. The terminal manager had become one of his closest friends, their shared experience having broken down all the old barriers between them. Sarah Thompson's arrival was different this time. No confrontation, no tension, just warm greetings from every staff member she passed. She had flown in specially for this conference, taking time from her busy schedule to see how far their program had come. "Welcome, everyone," Richard began his keynote speech. "1 year ago, I was a security guard who made a terrible mistake. I tried to stop a successful CEO from boarding her own jet because I let my prejudices cloud my judgment." He paused, looking at the packed room. "Today, I stand before you as living proof that people can change, that institutions can improve, and that mistakes can become stepping stones to something better." The audience listened intently as Richard shared their journey. He told them about the thousands of security staff they had trained, the zero-complaint record they had maintained for months, and the countless stories of positive changes from terminals across the country. In the middle of his presentation, the door opened quietly. A group of young security trainees from various airports entered, their faces full of hope and determination. Among them were people of all backgrounds, the future of aviation security. "Our success isn't measured just in numbers," Richard continued, gesturing to the new trainees. "It's measured in the stories we hear every day, like the young pilot who told us this was the first terminal where she wasn't questioned about her credentials, or the business owner who said he finally feels welcome at his own hangar." Sarah stood up to join Richard at the podium. Together, they unveiled their new initiative, a nationwide certification program for aviation security diversity training. What had started as one incident at one terminal was now becoming a national standard. "Change doesn't happen overnight," Sarah addressed the crowd. "It happens one person at a time, one conversation at a time, one moment of understanding at a time." She turned to Richard. "Sometimes it takes someone brave enough to admit their mistakes and turn them into lessons for others." After the main presentation, Richard walked through the terminal with Sarah. They passed Michael, now a senior trainer, teaching a group of new guards. They watched as diverse groups of passengers were greeted with respect and professionalism. "Ms. Thompson," Richard said, stopping near the spot where their story had begun, "do you remember what you told me that first day in the conference room? About how sometimes people just need a chance to learn and grow." Sarah nodded, smiling at the memory. "Well, you didn't just give me a chance that day," Richard continued. "You helped create a legacy that's changing our entire industry. As they stood there, a young black woman in casual clothes approached the terminal entrance. Without hesitation, she was greeted professionally, her credentials checked respectfully, and her path to her jet cleared efficiently. It was exactly how things should be, how they should have been all along. The day ended with a small ceremony where Richard handed out certificates to the first graduating class of their national training program. As he watched the diverse group of graduates celebrate their achievement, he thought about how one moment of confrontation had led to a movement of change. Sarah's voice had been right all along. Sometimes the best response to prejudice isn't punishment, but education. And sometimes the people who learn the hardest lessons become the best teachers. The sun set on the terminal, casting a warm glow over the parked jets and busy staff. Another day was ending, but the legacy of change they had created would continue to grow, one person, one lesson, one moment at a time.